You are listening to Talking Diplomacy. This is a podcast about diplomacy and international relations prepared by the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Early this spring, professionals of various fields came to Lithuanian capital to discuss the issues related to traumas of an undigested past. In a conference organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, experts from Europe, Asia and America were sharing their insights on how different societies are dealing with past traumas. In this episode, we will hear some of their thoughts about overcoming historical traumas through psychoanalytical processes and representation of collective memory in public spaces.
One of the big questions is, especially in decolonization processes or mass occupation that has come over years, what do you do with all of your statues? What do you actually do with all of these residual monuments?
We can talk about historical events in broad terms, but only hearing the personal stories we can picture the essence and the true impact of it. A tragic family story might become a signpost to their vocation. Dr. Armand Volkas is a psychotherapist, registered drama therapist and clinical director of a Living Arts Counseling Center in Oakland, California. He has developed innovative programs using drama therapy and expressive arts therapies for social change, intercultural conflict resolution, reconciliation, and intercultural communication. Dr. Volkas shares his personal story and insights made during years of working with conflicting parties.
In 1995, 50 years after the end of World War II, I made a pilgrimage to Auschwitz concentration camp where both of my parents were imprisoned for more than 2 years. I saw Block 10, where sterilization experiments had been performed on Jewish women, including my mother, by the infamous Dr. Klauberg. I visited the location where my father had worked processing the confiscated clothes, shoes, and other belongings of people sent to labor camps or to their death by the Nazis. I viewed the gas chambers. In the adjacent Birkenau concentration camp, I wandered around the area they called the burning fields. At a certain point in the war, or at the end of the war, there were so many transports bringing in Jews to be exterminated that the gas chambers were operating 24 hours a day. The crematoria could not dispose of the corpses fast enough. The Nazis ordered the camp inmates to create huge mountains of bodies and set them on fire. The bodies burned for weeks. The ashes were put in the nearby ponds and spread around the surrounding terrain. What struck me most, wandering around the former burning fields in the summer of 1995, was the fact that they were alive with the most beautiful wildflowers I had ever seen. I was moved by the way that nature was able to transform the results of such horror into beauty. This transformative principle guides my work as a psychotherapist, drama therapist, and theater director. In 2016, a group of 150 Albanians and Serbs are gathered in an ancient Ottoman Empire hammam bath, transformed into a makeshift theater. We are in the city of Prizren, near the southern border of Kosovo. The lighting is dim and shadowy. A young Kosovar Serbian actress sinks to her knees in a playback theater enactment and, stricken with grief, expresses her longing for a lost uncle. The uncle is still missing 16 years after Kosovo's ethnic conflict ended in 1999 and is presumed dead. On stage, the Kosovar Albanian man sitting in what is called the teller's chair, to her left, watches mesmerized. It is his story that the actress is performing, and though he was unable to understand her words spoken in Serbian, he shares with the audience that she has captured the essence of his grief and pain. Through a Healing the Wounds of History drama therapy process, followed by a playback theater training and performance, the Serbian and Albanian youth play back the history of violence between ethnic Albanians and Serbs in Kosovo. Doing so encourages empathy, healing, and the creation of new narratives of peace building and the beginning of social transformation. Years after NATO intervened in Kosovo to halt violent inter-ethnic conflict, ethnic Albanians and Serbs live and work in communities separated geographically, linguistically, administratively, and psychologically. Drama therapy, psychodrama, sociodrama, playback theater, and other action and expressive methods have the capacity to puncture the taboo against speaking to the enemy and unearth the ghosts lying in the graveyard of their unconscious. At the end of the evening, which was full of reenacted audience stories of the war, another audience member stood up and, in tears, asked the inter-ethnic theater group assembled in front of her, "Where have you been for the last 16 years?" Healing the Wounds of History, which is what I call my method, is a drama therapy approach to intercultural conflict transformation and healing historical trauma in individuals, groups, and society. This work is about a search for meaning. It is about memory and remembering. It is about sharing personal story and being witnessed. It is about how trauma is passed from generation to generation. It is about working through and integrating the complex emotions that arise when we face history in a personal way. It is about exploring what happens when the personal and the collective come together, when one person's story becomes the story of an entire people. It is about grief and mourning. It is about remembering and honoring the dead. It is about acknowledging and owning the potential perpetrator in all of us. It is about building bridges between cultures. It is about uncovering and transforming self-defeating historical narratives. It is about cultural and national identity and self-esteem, for humans have a need to feel positive about the tribe to which they belong. I was born in France to two Auschwitz survivors and resistance fighters who had managed to survive unspeakable trauma with their dignity intact. My mother was born in Poland and immigrated to France in the early 1930s. She was in the French resistance in Paris, was arrested and sent to Block 10, where I mentioned, in Auschwitz, where sterilization experiments were performed on Jewish women. My father was, as I mentioned before, was born in Jonava, Lithuania, and educated in Kaunas. He was first a volunteer in the International Brigade and fought against Franco during the Spanish Civil War. Later, he parachuted behind the lines in White Russia and was a partisan for a year, organizing resistance. My father was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. He became part of the underground there, where he devised the plan to help two people escape from the camp. After the war, my father learned that in 1941, all of the Jews of Jonava, which included my father's entire family, were made to dig their own graves and were then executed by the German Einsatzgruppen and Lithuanian collaborators. In the mid-1950s, my family and I, as a young child, immigrated to the United States from France, and I came into consciousness in Southern California, far from the blood-soaked earth of Europe. I grew up with two people suffering from intense and severe PTSD. As a young man, I struggled with my Jewish identity. My first response to my Holocaust legacy in my 20s and as an actor and director was to create an experimental theater company in Los Angeles that produced plays on Jewish themes. My rationale was Hitler killed Jews, but also tried to kill Jewish culture. I felt like the greatest revenge to Hitler would be to create new Jewish culture. At the same time, in the mid-1970s, sons and daughters of Jewish Holocaust survivors in the United States began to discover each other and compare our experience. We were a very studied group. It seemed that every doctoral psychology student at the time was doing their dissertation on our dysfunction and our trauma, and not on our resilience. The support groups were helpful at first, but after a while, I saw that the children of survivor support groups were only serving to perpetuate our narrative of victimization. I was interested in transforming my victimization, not wallowing in it. I began to wonder about the Germans of my generation. What were they thinking and feeling? Were the children of perpetrators struggling with their legacy like I was? I felt driven to understand the evil behind the Holocaust and knew that the closest I could get to working with Nazis was to work with their children who knew them intimately. In May of 1989, by then having become a psychotherapist and drama therapist, I invited 7 children of Holocaust survivors and 7 children of Nazis to spend several days together exploring the legacy they carried from the war. I led these groups through a series of drama therapy exercises in which they enacted each other's stories and dreams, explored specific memories and dilemmas, and created rituals to help each other find some closure with particularly painful experiences. I realized that this work was very powerful and that I could have an impact on the world. I had found my life's work. After this experience, I conducted multiple workshops in Germany and the United States on the legacy of the war. Over the next several years, my work evolved. In France, I worked with the legacy of French collaboration with Nazi Germany during World War II and the Algerian War. I have since brought together Palestinians and Israelis, Japanese and Chinese on the legacy of the Nanjing massacre, Koreans and Japanese on the legacy of comfort women, Tamil and Sinhalese in the aftermath of their civil war, Armenians and Turks, Turks and Kurds, Kosovo, Albanians and Serbs, the factions involved in the Lebanese civil war, indigenous Canadians and the descendants of white settlers, to name a few. The list goes on, and as we know, there's no shortage of historical trauma to heal on the individual and collective level. Since its beginnings in 1989, the Healing the Wounds of History approach has evolved from the use of drama therapy in intercultural conflict transformation with 2 or more polarized groups into multiple applications, including workshops that focus on historical trauma and its impact on a single group, culture, or nation, most recently with Cambodian refugees commemorating the 40th anniversary of the end of the Cambodian genocide, or working in China on the legacy of the Tiananmen Rebellion, Cultural Revolution, one-child policy, famine, civil war, Japanese occupation, and colonialism. Another use of this method involves gatherings open to persons of diverse cultures who wish to explore their personal legacy of generational, collective, ancestral, or historical trauma. My approach can also include individual autobiographical therapeutic performances. In this application, there is a historical and generational trauma present in the narrative of the client that needs healing or transformation. A solo performance is created as a therapeutic act for invited, trustworthy witnesses. Other applications include therapeutic theater projects in which a group carrying historical or generational trauma devises a theater piece as a therapeutic act and shares it with the public. For example, a group of Palestinians might come together to create and perform a theater piece about their struggle. Finally, the application of playback theater performances, which involves transforming personal stories into improvised theater pieces on the spot, incorporating music, movement, ritual, and spoken improvisation. This performance, combined with creative ritual or an official public commemoration of a traumatic event, follows an intensive workshop on the memory of the collective trauma. For example, in 2005, for the 60th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a day-long workshop at International House in Berkeley, California, was organized with Japanese participants. An evening commemoration was open to the public. The performance commemoration featured an Okinawan music ensemble, a troupe of taiko drummers, a playback theater performance, and an art installation. Audience members participated in an interactive public forum and finally placed 1,000 origami cranes on a peace tree. At the heart of the evening were the powerful testimonies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors whose stories were honored by the playback theater enactments. With Japanese and American cultures as the ultimate clients, the event was organized to help give shape to and release the unexpressed grief and outrage about the collective historical traumatic event and motivate the audience to take social action against nuclear proliferation. And in closing, as a psychotherapist, drama therapist, and theater director, I trust in the profound healing and transformative principles found in nature, in Auschwitz, where the horror of the ashes of the cremated bodies scattered around the burning fields can be transformed into transcendentally beautiful wildflowers.
Transformation also marks the work of internationally renowned artist Esther Shalev-Gerz. She investigates the construction of memory, history, the natural world, democracy, and cultural identities. Her monuments, installations, photography, video, and public sculpture are developed through active dialogue, consultation, and negotiation with people whose participation provides an emphasis to their individual and collective memories, accounts, opinions, and experiences, which then become both represented and considered. During the conference in Vilnius, Esther Shalev-Gerz told her story and discussed her transformative work, which constructs new memory and aims to spark a public debate.
I was born in Vilnius. My mother grew up and survived in the forest, being hidden there by a teacher that took the whole class into the forest in Russia. So she survived and grew up 4 years in this condition. My father, that is from Ignalina, she's from Alytus, and he's from Ignalina. And he was running away when the war started, and he was drafted to the Russian army, and he was a Russian soldier and survived Stalin, survived Hitler. And they met here. By the way, I never talk about my private story, but I thought that's a good occasion to air it and see how I articulate it and how you receive it. And so we went to Jerusalem when my father found his brother, means the only member of the family, because the rest were killed and disappeared. So I had inherit this empty room from my mother that didn't know much. When I was born, she was pretty young. She always said, you cried, I cried, father cried. So I thought, that's weird. But I had this space available, and I knew I want to be an artist pretty early, because I thought I was going to this museum with the class, and I saw how they replaced rooms. They hang it all up, and our next visit, it was all put down, and there was another room filled up. And somehow it intrigued me, and so I became an artist. And I also, before that, I married to an Israeli person that I thought he's wonderful because he knew Israeli songs that I didn't know so much, because I came there with Lithuanian, Yiddish, and Russian as languages, and he was fantastic, and I thought that's very fabulous. And so after that, I started my practice as an artist, and at one moment, in '83, we were doing a big exhibition in the Golan, in front of the Golan Heights, and we were doing art. And just above 2 kilometers, there was raging war, the Lebanese war. Somehow, this coincidence opened up also to me to meet a German artist that came to participate and lived in Paris. This is how I more or less landed in Paris in '84. So make it all as forward to the work that I'm gonna present, the first work. So the city of Hamburg in the late 70s, beginning of 80s, started to have a phenomena. They didn't have the name, but it was the neo-fascism. So they wanted to have a cultural tool and a competition about a monument against fascism. That's an absurdity, because a monument are always for. But I grew up in Israel and here, and there was always this looming big monuments. There was the Russian Soviet monuments that were always higher than us, especially me. And then there was the Holocaust monuments that we were taken every spring, would start for the young Israeli kids, would start like you. First, there is Pesach, where you are liberated being a slave. Then you go to the Holocaust Memorial, where you were kind of finished. And then there is a fight for the new land, and then there is the Day of Independence. So every spring would start with these 4 events, and every time it would be with more details and more details. And somehow it started intuitively in my brain to say, what do we do as artists? What is our place? And for me it was, how can you make a work around violent events without evoking the violence? I think this is the art. I remember speaking with Leon Golom, a wonderful American artist, and he, in front of his big painting, where there is 3 white men beating up a black person. And I said, it's really very dramatic, but what are we gonna do? The black person will be always on the floor being beaten, and the white will be always there. So the Hamburg Monument, when Jochen Gertz, my husband, the German artist, said to me, let's do the competition for a monument against fascism. I said, look, you know, I want all monuments to disappear. If we manage to do a monument that disappears, then I'm okay. So we made this proposal, and the proposal was accepted by the city. It's a 12 meters cubic, and it's 1 meter by 1 meter covered with lead, inviting the citizen and the people that pass by with a text saying, please sign your name against fascism on it, because a monument cannot fight against fascism. It's us, ourselves, that should do that. At the opening, it was horrible. The people hated the monument. And they said, why is it not this wonderful big lion with the name of victims? And why do we have to sign? And then they started to talk about fascism and what is fascism in the life. And I was amazed. It was scary, but it was fantastic because you saw those faces that finally cracked open, and people with very clumsy words are trying to communicate and let themselves hear about it. There was a lot of journalists asking how much it cost so much because the mechanism was pretty expensive. And the idea was every time it's filled up where we can reach, it will be lowered into the ground. In the commission, they said, can we not start the other way around and do it like this, and then we'll have the object that we paid for? We said, no, 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 no possible. We have to remember our act of signing or not signing. So it's about inaugurating a new memory. So this is the panel of the text, the foretext, the end of the war, Hebrew because of me, Arabic because of Hebrew, and Turkish because of the Turks. So what was actually the savior was the wall in Berlin that disappeared. And people started to say, oh, that's very interesting. Maybe because something disappeared can also be good. It's not only bad. And then the New York Times came, and till today, this work that actually was the first monument in Germany around fascism, because the big discussion and the building of their monument in Berlin started after the 90s. So I thought if in Israel we have so many monuments, in Germany there will be 100 times more, but there were none. There was no discourse. There was some obscure places in universities, but really there was none. So during these 7 years, I would regularly come to Hamburg and have these discussions and have this journalist and have the politician talking about it. And somehow it energized also a lot of other artists. There is other beautiful works that were done by Micha Ullmann in Berlin. When you go at the place where the Jewish books were burned, and you look and you see a room underneath in the earth of empty library, and many more. In a way, for me, the biggest material is the earth. Is this thing that we actually don't look at. It's the thing we fight for, where we become kind of hero. This is kind of, the place became the spot of discussions, of reactions. People would put swastika, people tried to demolish it, people tried to put a heart and say, I love to Snelda. It was like a place that finally was you allowed to express yourself. So for me, I said anybody that touched it is actually in the context of that monument. Today, this is how it is. They wanted to have the monument in the park, usually the case. We said, no way. It should stand between the market and the way you go to the metro and you go to the mayor, so people can see it, discuss it, and maybe it's not very sexy for the artist or the occasion, but at that time, I always say, it's important. At that time, it was necessary to put it in the public place. So the courage of the decisive bodies and the cultural bodies in Germany at that time was amazing. And I also think it's inspired a lot of discussion. And today, a lot of people, when I give a talk, and I don't talk about this work because I have many more, they say, oh, you should know about this monument against fascism. Because as other people that talked about monuments, they don't talk about the artists anymore, and we are not so important. But we are important about this kind of freedom that we gain by actually being allowed to realize a work in public space that makes a debate in a time you need a debate.
Monuments take an important place not only in public spaces, but also in our collective memory. Historian Timothy Ryback claims that statues and monuments are a crucial part of our history. He is a director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague.
In some ways, the statues, the public monuments are really a reification of human trauma, and in some ways are the most visible expression of this historical trauma because they're in public spaces and we live with them every day. For the last 4 years, we have been tracking historical contestations in public spaces, and we've identified 140 current hotspots in the world that are currently taking place. Our project was born out of an attempt to understand what one can do to find practical solutions for resolving these types of conflict. My first example is the Holocaust. Many of you know this is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe on the Potsdamer Platz in Berlin. It was contested and controversial when it was built. It remains so. We could spend the rest of the day talking about it. I have personal opinions about how effective or not this is, but I'd actually like to focus on another German form of commemoration for the Holocaust, and that are these things called stumbling stones, Stolpersteine. There are, to date, 60,000 of these Stolpersteine across Europe. It has been called the largest public memorial in the world. The power of this type of commemoration, these are stones, cobblestones, which are put in front of the houses where Jewish families had lived. And the narratives are very simple. It says, here lives, there's Samuel Heim, the year he was born, when he was arrested, and then Sachsenhausen, where he was murdered. What one can do with this personalized view of the Holocaust, which is impossible in a large memorial, is that what you'll often see is that the child is in between both parents. Sometimes you'll see the dates when they were taken from the homes, and you see a family being picked apart day by day. Now, to my mind, the power of this is not only the individual experiences there, but the fact that it's woven into the fabric of daily life in Germany, in every German town, without it actually being imposed on it. You can look and study these stones if you want. You can ignore them if you feel your past has been left behind, but they exist and they are with you always, and I believe they will last as long as there are cobblestone streets in Germany. These Stolpersteine will be there. They're also scattered throughout Europe. With a little bit of searching, I also found 2 stumbling stones here in Vilnius, which as you begin exploring this, and I believe these are the only 2, but it may be one way of thinking about how to engage with and deal with these traumas.
Some past events will never leave us and will haunt the victims and perpetrators until we find the right way to acknowledge and make peace with it. Thank you for listening. We hope this episode provided a new angle at which we can think about the historical tragedies and the ways to digest them. Stay tuned for future episodes, and you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Flickr. Thank you.